This object the inspector pocketed, and after that the two men went quietly up the stairs. They remained for more than an hour, the inspector an interested bystander most of the time, and before they left Dean, as the slimmer of the two, had crawled through a small window onto the roof of the kitchen porch and had there carefully examined the guttering and the opening of the waterspout. Whatever he had found inside the house, he found nothing there, and at last the two had departed, Herbert to a microscope in a laboratory downtown, where I believe he examined an ordinary house sponge, and the inspector to that interrogation of Brian Dalton which had so exasperated everyone working on the case. Mother rallied long enough that evening to eat a squab and some blancmange, but she was in a bad humor. Dr. Armstrong had come in at 6 o'clock to give her her hypodermic of iron, but he was too much interested in Holmes's disappearance and too little in her own annoyance to please her. "That's another instance of what I'm talking about," he said. "The servants here know Holmes is taking out his clothes, but do they tell? They do not. The whole damned Crescent is a conspiracy of silence." Mother eyed him coldly. "The people who could talk will never talk again, Doctor. Besides, why go further than we have gone? This deliberate disappearance of my chauffeur can mean only one thing." "You honestly believe that Holmes is guilty?" "Why not? He's probably had that gold hidden somewhere all the time, and now he's got away with it." "And who but Holmes could have attacked Louisa?" "He was locked in, wasn't he?" "How do we know he hadn't a second key?" "But why attack Lou, of all people?" "That's for the police to find out," said Mother loftily. "Although I must say what they have found so far doesn't justify any hope in that direction." "But people do very strange things sometimes, Doctor. I well remember when our dear Bishop got up one night, walked into his wife's room and simply jerked the footboard off her bed. He said afterwards that he had been asleep, but I have always wondered. When I left the room to see the doctor out, he voiced what I was feeling. Let her think it, if she can, he said. Maybe she's right at that, but I don't believe it. Still, it probably comforts her to blame him. She's got in him a criminal she can accept. He belongs to the class, which, according to her ideas, normally produces criminals. And she's been afraid it was somebody else, Lou. Don't forget that. She's been afraid of that from the start. That was at 6 o'clock, and both the car and Holmes remained among the missing until 9 o'clock that night. Then it was Inspector Briggs who brought me the word that the one had been found, if not the other. "We have your car, Miss Hall," he said. It was abandoned quite a way out of town, and a sheriff's car picked it up. They'll bring it back in the morning. Annie had shown him into the library, and now he sat pinching his lip as usual and with his eyes fixed on me intently. "You know, Miss Hall, the deeper I get into this thing, and God knows I'm over my head already, the more I believe that it's the story we're after. A story." Get the story and you understand the rest. And maybe when we understand, well, maybe this piece has a villain and maybe it hasn't, if you see what I mean. It was a pretty wicked thing to kill those two women, wasn't it? It's a pretty wicked thing to kill anybody. And it's a pretty wicked thing, too, to send somebody to the chair unless he deserves it. I could lie awake nights worrying about things I've never been so sure of as the public has been. Well. He leaned forward in his chair. "Let's get this crescent of yours clear," he said. "Relationships, old quarrels, all the freakish ideas, like that one of Mrs. Talbot's about locking herself in. What's wrong between young Wellington and his wife, if anything? And even here, in this house. What about yourselves? And where does this Holmes come in? As I recall it, he had your mother out for a drive on the day Mrs. Lancaster was murdered." "He did. But he has been rather queer, Inspector, ever since." He listened while I told him about that night when I had seen him tearing pages out of a book, although he seemed to set rather less store by it than Herbert Dean had done. "Funny performance," was his comment. "I don't suppose you know what sort of book it was?" "It was a detective story." "Was, eh? Well, that doesn't mean he's a criminal."